Hey everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here, walking down 3rd Avenue, and I'm in the hub of one of Portland's many food cart stretches, and it's a good place to start another episode of Historic Murders of Portland. So today, on Southwest 3rd Avenue between Harvey Milk Street, which used to be Stark, and Washington Street, today it's just a bunch of food carts lined up on the road. But many years ago, there was a really big building. It was called the Abington Building. And come November 28th, 1908, the Abington Building here, which had offices, probably storefronts on the bottom floor, it lined a good chunk of this intersection. Come that day, a guy named James Finch walked into a store in the building and obtained for himself a revolver. Now, life for James Finch around this time was not going great. He was an attorney. He was also a heavy alcoholic. And that, probably, among other things, was affecting him and his performance. And he came up for disbarment, which that's essentially us saying, hey, you went to school for this, you did all this work for this, well, you did something wrong and we're going to fire you now for it, pretty much. And he was up for a disbarment. And it happened shortly before this date, a little earlier. He came up and was disbarred as a lawyer. He was given a 1-year disbarment, which actually it seems like many people wanted it to be a much stiffer punishment, but he was pretty much let off easy. But despite that, he was not happy with that situation. All of a sudden, the job that he's worked for, he can't do for a year, so, what's he going to do for money? And he held one person specifically responsible for his hardships. The reason he ended up at the Abington Building here buying a gun. And the guy that he held responsible was a guy named Ralph B. Fisher, who, tragically enough, only a week or two before this November 28th date, when Finch went off the deep end, he had reported to police that he had been getting anonymous letters from people threatening his life. So he was fearful for himself. So James Finch, after being a little bit north of here earlier in the day, he had an objective location. He was trying to get to the Mohawk Building, which is this building. Not this one. This is Centennial Block. But this is the Mohawk Building. And he was trying to get here because Ralph Fisher, whose office I believe is on the 2nd floor of this building, Ralph Fisher just happened to be, one of his main jobs was he was essentially a prosecutor in cases where other attorneys were up for disbarment for whatever the reason. And possibly because of his alcoholism affecting him, whatever the reason, James Finch had come up for disbarment. And the guy that was taking his case was Ralph Fisher, whose offices were in this building. So it came out later that Ralph Fisher did pretty much everything in his power to get leniency for Finch. But apparently that wasn't enough. So Ralph Fisher he's just up in his office. It's just another day at work going through, I don't know, whatever he had going on. And he's in there with his stenographer. So there's actually someone in there in the office with him. I believe her name was Verna Burkhart, I want to say was her name. I could be mixing up my cases. And they're just in there doing their job. And suddenly James Finch walks in, apparently very, very quietly. Doesn't want anybody to know that they're there. And maybe he didn't realize there was going to be another person in there with Fisher. And he just casually opened the door, walked in, and it happened so quick. Fisher literally didn't have time to even know what happened. He was hit in the back of the head. He obviously wasn't facing the front door at that moment. And yeah, he got struck in the back of the head and just fell limp from his chair down onto the ground, down onto the floor of his office. It had happened that quickly. Finch just walked in, pointed the gun in, fired once or twice. I've heard both. Up in his office up here, and then just walked out. And of course there was a witness there, the stenographer, and people in the building had heard the gunfire and were all coming out to see what was going on. And yeah, Finch didn't even make it out of the building before he was grabbed by people there. And you could say James Finch was pretty out there by this time. I don't know if he had just imbibed too much alcohol over the course of his life, or he had some kind of a complex. I don't really know, and it could just be that he was trying to do a good job of portraying a insanity defense for later. But it was so obviously intentional. It was cold, it was calculated. He walked in, he knew exactly who he was looking for and apparently where to find him. There was no reports of him poking his head into other offices or anything. He just walked in, did it, and walked out. Doesn't even seem like he ran for it. So, he's grabbed quick, he's obtained, he's interviewed by the police, and he acts like he wasn't there, even though there's a witness up there. People hear the gunfire, they see him in the building, they already know that there's got to be a little bit of bad blood, because even though he did his best to help him, ultimately James Finch got a 1-year disbarment, which he continuously reminded the authorities of. Oh, I'm disbarred. Am I taken into police custody because I'm disbarred? I got disbarred, right? Ralph Fisher freaking disbarred me. Everybody knows about it. Like, he was just ranting about his disbarment. But he denied being in the building. He denied doing the shooting. He gave some story about how he said he called Fisher that day about some petition that he wanted signed, and or Finch contacted Fisher about a petition he wanted signed, and Fisher wouldn't do it. And so he claimed Finch to have gone to a couple saloons, kind of in this area around the Morrison and Alder streets, and had a few drinks with some guys, and apparently got pretty drunk, because that was all he did now. And next thing he knows, he's going down an elevator. It doesn't say where, he's just going down an elevator. Someone grabs him, and next thing you know, he's at the police station. So he's, of course, acting like he has no memory of his actions here, even though plenty of, it was obvious that he had done it. And he played the insanity card so well out of the gate that even as he just flat out denied any involvement, he started making the comments of, hey, who I bet's going to walk through the door into this police office any moment? Ralph Fisher. Ralph Fisher's going to walk in any second. He's going to be like, hey, what's going on? The guy who he had just murdered, of course. So yeah, this guy was really out of his mind at this point. And he even tried to get the police to go a little light on him by reminding him, whether it was true or not, I don't know if it was true, but he reminded them that he had just been married 10 days earlier. As though that has any bearing in this case. Like, oh, you have a family? Fine, we'll just let you walk for a cold-blooded murder. So strange. And, a huge case. in Portland. You know, these weren't just a couple of drunkards getting in a street fight over a couple of, you know, coins they found. This was a guy that was a high-ranking member of the, you know, the bar association here. This guy was a prosecutor. This was a big deal in this city that something like this would happen just so out of nowhere, so quickly. You know, the whole thing was over and done probably within 5 to 10 seconds. And fast forward ahead, I probably look a little different than I did earlier in this video. Something very interesting that I learned in the aftermath. Finch has shot Fisher. Finch shot Fisher. That sounds like a tongue twister. And interestingly enough, somebody would play a part in Finch's defense in the trial for the shooting of a very prominent local attorney. He was like a law partner with him. Any of his defense was Charles Peugeot, which, if you've never heard of Charles Peugeot, he wrote this really bizarre book about how to pearls at, I can't remember what it's called, pearls at least strung, something like that. I have the book. It's insane. It tells you all these wild ways about how to take care of yourself. He wrote it around turn of the century. He was the guy who had the famous Peugeot castle built in the West Hills way off this direction. If you get a clear enough view, especially if you're in like the PSU area and looking south, you'll see this house that kind of looks like a castle. That was Charles Peugeot's home. Only for a year though. He spent all this time having it built. He had this tower that people reported up in that tower is where he wrote his book. He's very prominent in this area. Apparently a very bizarre, neurotic type, but he was a close colleague with this Finch character and helped him with his defense and relation. And it came out that 2 days before the shooting, Fisher already knows that he's already been getting reports that Finch has it out for him. And Fisher in his office, which again I think was on the 3rd floor, somewhere up in this building, he got a call from Charles Peugeot 2 days before the shooting happened. He wasn't available. I think an assistant answered it, told him he's not available, can he get back to you? Charles Peugeot never called back, and it's unknown to this day exactly what he wanted to call to talk to Fisher about, but it is interesting that 2 days later, a close colleague of Peugeot comes in and shoots Fisher. I mean, you have to wonder what was going on. And of course, when Finch has to establish his defense now for this shooting, he has to somehow try to argue his innocence best he can. And there were even efforts done by the defense to try to claim that Fisher had actually called Finch and tried to get him to come to his office, and therefore was leading Finch into an ambush type situation, because Finch would say that when he arrived at Fisher's office in the Mohawk Building here, that they started talking and Fisher ordered him to leave, and in that seeming seeds for a scuffle being set, Fisher grabbed a notary seal. And again, this is Finch's story about what happened. Fisher grabbed a notary seal, which I guess is a big thing, nailed him in the head with it, put him down, and then he immediately ran for his desk like he was trying to get something out of his desk, and Finch thought that he was going for a gun, which then he says, well, I have to do self-defense. If this guy's going to go for a weapon in his drawer, I have to use my weapon. The question, though, is why did he show up with a gun on him? Why did Finch show up with a gun on him if he wasn't intending to shoot Fisher? And as ridiculous as this story sounds, there was at least one witness in the aftermath that said he saw Finch shortly after the shooting and said that he had a big bump on his head, like he'd been struck with something. And interestingly enough, if you look right across from the building, Pioneer Place is here now. Obviously, back in the first decade of the 1900s, this was not here. There was another building here, and there were reportedly people who were working in this building, probably 3rd floor. You know, they were able to look across and see into the Mohawk Building, and they said that they saw 2 men scuffling together, which almost serves to vindicate Finch's story, that there was some kind of altercation happening. Fisher goes for a gun, Finch gets his gun out, and Finch just manages to shoot him first. However, here's where it all comes apart. Fisher, the notary seal he supposedly used, when police reported to the scene immediately after the shooting event, his notary seal was locked in one of his desk drawers. Which means, if he was shot and he fell, that means at the time the shooting took place, his notary seal is sitting locked in his drawer, and that means that, Finch couldn't get his hands on it, so how does he attack Finch with his notary seal? Finch probably just knew that a notary seal was the kind of thing that a lawyer would have, because they were both lawyers, and he probably just thought, that sounds like a logical thing to say he would attack me with. He obviously didn't think his story through enough, though, because the notary seal was locked away and couldn't have been involved. So, at the end of the day, Finch's story was just a bunch of chaos to try to save himself, because he thought at heart he'd been wronged. I'm sure he had an inferiority complex, thought the world was out against him. He was a heavy drinker, that didn't help. And he probably felt fully justified in doing what he did, but he still knew that society, being a lawyer, he knew society wasn't just going to accept that he was a brutally wronged man and that would be enough for them to let him off. He had to come up with some kind of BS defense to try to defend himself. And that's what he went with, was that Fisher tried to attack him first, and it was self-defense. He shot Fisher before Fisher could shoot him. So, fast forward ahead to the end of the year, December 30th, 1908. Finch is ultimately convicted for the murder of Fisher and was sentenced to death, sentenced to hang. And, obviously he's a lawyer, he has lawyer friends. He tried his best to get a retrial, get an appeal for what had happened over here, up in this building. And it never happened, it was denied. He was able to get a brief stay in terms of his execution, but by November 1909, he would be hung for the murder of Fisher, 3rd floor of the Mohawk Building, right here. Pretty iconic case at the time. A very prominent Portlander getting killed off in such a bizarre way, seemingly out of revenge. So that's it from Mohawk Building. I'm at 3rd and Morrison, so I'm in the heart of downtown, the heart and liver and kidneys of this city. And yeah, so thank you again so much for watching. As always, and remember, as always, to like, share, subscribe, comment, hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. And until next time, guys, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you next time.